The courtroom was electric, the air thick with tension. Outside, the world was watching, glued to their screens, waiting for the next move in a case that had everyone talking. Inside, it was a different kind of pressure. Diddy, the man who had built an empire on ambition, talent, and hustle, now stood at the center of a storm. His name, synonymous with success and luxury, was now tainted by accusations that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. The room was silent, but you could feel the weight of the moment in every corner of the courtroom. The judge, the jury, and the legal teams on both sides were ready for the next round. But there was something in fear that told you this wasn't going to be just another day in court. Diddy had always been the type to keep his cards close to his chest, to remain the cool, calculated businessman, never letting anyone see what was really going on inside his mind. But this time, something was different. His face was drawn, his usual swagger replaced with acquiescent resolve. As he sat in that chair, facing his accusers, his past, and his future all at once, it was clear that the man who had conquered the world of entertainment was now fighting for something much more personal. His freedom, his legacy, and maybe even his soul. The accusations against him were serious, impossible to ignore. Money laundering, fraudulent business dealings, allegations that could not only ruin his career, but could send him to prison. And, for someone like Diddy, someone who had built his life around his image, these charges carried an even heavier weight. His defense team had worked tirelessly to craft the perfect case, to deflect, to dodge, to twist the narrative. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. But as the trial dragged on, as the evidence piled up, the walls began to close in. Diddy had maintained his innocence, but even his closest allies were starting to wonder if the story he had been telling the world was actually true. Had he really been the victim of a conspiracy, or was just a man caught in the crossfire of his own ambition? The courtroom murmured as Diddy's lawyer rose to make their closing argument. His words were measured, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimony. You've witnessed the truth of what has transpired. My client is not guilty of the charges against him. He is a victim of circumstance, a victim of his success." The words were carefully crafted, designed to tug at the heartstrings, to paint Diddy as the misunderstood mogul who had simply made a few wrong moves. But as the lawyer spoke, Diddy sat still, his eyes distant, focused on something beyond the courtroom. Then came the moment that no one expected. Diddy stood up, his voice steady, but laced with a gravity that couldn't be ignored. The room fell. Silent. The judge, the prosecution, the defense, they all looked at him. Was he about to declare his innocence one last time? Was this the final battle to save his reputation? Instead, Diddy took a deep breath and began to speak. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I need to say something. Something I should have said a long time ago. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now, let's get back to it. I've spent my life building this empire, this legacy," Diddy continued, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "I've worked harder than anyone I know to get here, to become the person you see in front of you today. But I can't stand here and lie to you anymore. I've made mistakes, big mistakes, and I'm not proud of them, but I can't keep pretending like everything I've done was perfect." The courtroom was stunned. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The defense attorneys exchanged nervous glances, their carefully constructed cases suddenly feeling fragile. The prosecution couldn't hide their smug satisfaction. They knew this moment would work in their favor. And the judge, though composed, raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by what was happening. Diddy paused, looking out over the room as if searching for the right words. "There are things I've done that I'm not proud of. There are deals I've made, people I've hurt, situations I've walked away from. And maybe I've tried to hide behind my success, behind my money and my image, because I didn't want to face the truth. But now I'm here, and I can't keep running from it." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every person in that room could feel the weight of Diddy's confession, the vulnerability he had just exposed. This was not the man they had expected to hear from. This wasn't the confident mogul who was always in control, who never seemed to break. Diddy's admission wasn't just about the case at hand. It was about the man behind the persona, the human being who had struggled, who had failed, and who was finally owning up to it all. And in that moment, the courtroom seemed to shift. What had started as a high-stake legal battle now felt like something more, a deeply personal reckoning. But what would this confession mean for the case? Would it help him, or would it cost him everything? The room held its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Diddy's words echoed in the courtroom, hanging in the air, leaving everyone frozen in place. His confession had struck a chord, not just with the jury, but with everyone who had been watching this case unfold. For the first time, the image of the untouchable mogul, the man who had always controlled the narrative, was cracked open. Behind the bravado, behind the media empire, was a man who had made mistakes, who had faced consequences, and who was finally acknowledging the truth. The room was still, the only sound, the slow and steady tapping of a pen on the defense table. It was as if everyone was waiting for something, waiting for the next shoe to drop, for Diddy to elaborate on what he had just confessed. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there, his gaze focused, locked on the judge. His eyes were tired, almost defeated, as if he knew this wasn't going to end how he wanted, but also that he had nothing left to hide. The defense team was in a state of shock. This was not part of the plan. The carefully constructed narrative, the perfectly crafted story about Diddy's innocence, was suddenly shattered by the very man they had been defending. His admission of guilt, however vague, had changed everything. The legal battle was no longer about proving innocence. It was now about damage control, about how to spin this confession in a way that could salvage what little was left of Diddy's reputation. The prosecution, on the other hand, couldn't contain their excitement. The moment Diddy had confessed, the victory seemed all but assured. They had always suspected that Diddy had skeletons in his closet. But hearing him speak those words aloud, admitting to things he had never before acknowledged, was like gold to them. They had been waiting for this moment, and now that it had arrived, they knew they had the upper hand. But even they were taken aback by how vulnerable Diddy had made himself. There was something raw about it, something real. Diddy cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had descended over the room. He looked down at his feet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts before he continued. "I don't expect anyone to forgive me for what I've done," he said, his voice a little more steady now, though still tinged with the emotion he couldn't quite hide. "But I need you all to understand something. I'm not the man I used to be. I've made mistakes, and I've paid the price for them. The mistakes that led me here, this courtroom, these charges, they're not just about what I did. They're about who he became because of them." He paused, his eyes scanning the room now, meeting the gaze of the jury, the judge, the prosecution, and even his own team. "I spent so many years building this empire, my reputation, my brand, focusing on the outside, but I ignored what was happening on the inside. Ignored the cracks that were forming in my own life, in my relationships, and in the way I conducted business, and now those cracks are coming to light." The courtroom remained silent. Even the reporters who had been taking notes in the back seemed to stop typing, their eyes fixed on Diddy. This was no longer a typical court case. This was something much bigger. This was a reckoning. "Look," Diddy continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "I built my career in the backs of people I worked with, on the loyalty of the people who believed in me. But I can't deny that somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. I hurt people. I made choices that weren't always ethical. And I wasn't the person I claimed to be in front of the cameras. I've been running from that truth for a long time. And maybe this is the moment I have to face it all." As Diddy spoke, there was a shift in the room. The tension that had gripped the courtroom now felt like something else, like the kind of honesty that couldn't be faked. It wasn't a strategy, and it wasn't an act. This wasn't the Diddy the world knew, the polished public figure who always had something to sell. This was the man behind the facade standing there, vulnerable, exposed. His confession wasn't just about the mistakes he had made. It was about the lessons he had learned from them. Diddy wasn't just speaking to the jury, he was speaking to himself. For the first time, it seemed like he was taking responsibility not just for his actions, but for the way those actions had shaped his life and the lives of others. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the end of Diddy's statement. But the impact of his words had already done its damage. The confession had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The defense team knew they had a new challenge ahead of them, one that would require more than just legal tactics. They now had to contend with the human side of this case, the side of Diddy that had just been laid bare. The prosecution, meanwhile, prepared for the final stretch. They were no longer fighting just for a conviction. They were fighting for redemption. They had the confession. Now they had to figure out how to use it to their advantage. But even they knew that there was no turning back now. Diddy had spoken, and the world was listening. The trial was far from over. But one thing was certain. Diddy's life, his career, and his legacy would never be the same again. The courtroom may have been quiet, but outside the world was buzzing with questions. Could this confession be the turning point that Diddy needed to escape the consequences of his actions? Or would it be the final nail in the coffin for a man who had everything to lose? No one could predict what was coming next. One thing was for sure, this was only the beginning. The weight of Diddy's words still hung in the courtroom as the tension seemed to multiply by the second. His confession had been a bombshell, and for a moment it seemed as if time itself had slowed down. Everyone in the room, from the defense team to the jury, the prosecution, and even the gallery of onlookers, was left in a stunned silence. Diddy, the mogul had always projected an image of control, now stood before them as a man who had finally let his guard down. But real question now was, what would come of this? What did his admission mean for the case that had captivated nation for weeks? For Diddy's legal team, the fallout from the confession was immediate. They had spent days, weeks, carefully crafting their defense, constructing a narrative that would portray their client as an innocent man wrongfully accused. They had prepared for the worst. But this was beyond their control. The confession wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was raw, unfiltered honesty. And for all their preparation, they were left scrambling to find a way to spin it. Could they salvage the case, or had Diddy's honesty just sealed his fate? They exchanged quick, nervous glances, the head lawyer, usually the picture of composure, had his hands folded tightly in front of him. His face was unreadable, but his mind was racing. How could they possibly recover from this? They had just lost control of the narrative, and they knew it. The legal battle was no longer about proving Diddy's innocence. It was about controlling the damage caused by his own confession. The prosecution, on the other hand, had never been so certain of victory. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The damning admission from Diddy himself had shifted everything in their favor. They knew they had their smoking gun. His own words, spoken in front of a courtroom full of people, could be enough to ensure a conviction. But as much as they were basking in their advantage, there was a sense of caution. Even they knew that a confession like this, so raw, so vulnerable, was not an easy thing to digest. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about public perception, and the public, like the jury, would need time to process the magnitude of Diddy's revelation. But as the silence stretched on, something unexpected happened. Diddy, who had previously appeared to be on the verge of collapse, took a deep breath and gathered himself. He wasn't done. He hadn't said everything he needed to. The room, already on edge, braced itself for what he would say next. "I know you're all looking at me," Diddy began again, his voice steady now, as though he had found his footing. "You're probably wondering why I'm standing here admitting all of this. Why would I do this? Why would I put myself out there in front of all of you, knowing it could ruin everything you've built?" He paused for a moment, glancing around the room, meeting the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. "Because this isn't about me anymore. This is about the truth. I've spent too long running from it, pretending like I was something I wasn't, but I can't keep living that way. The people I've hurt, the mistakes I've made, they matter. They need to be acknowledged. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step in fixing everything that's broken. There was a collective exhale from Courtroom, a mix of disbelief and awe. For a moment, Diddy wasn't the powerful mogul, the business tycoon who had everything. He was just a man who had made mistakes. Yes, but a man who was willing to face them head on. The prosecution sat back, a mix of curiosity and calculation in their eyes. They knew that Diddy's words could be powerful, but would they be enough to sway the jury? Would the human side of him be now to mitigate the damage caused by his past actions, or would it only make things worse? Their job was clear. They had to capitalize on the confession. They had to keep pushing, keep hammering away at Diddy's credibility. And yet, even they couldn't help but wonder if this admission would humanize him in a way they hadn't anticipated. The defensitum, meanwhile, was trying to rally. Their heads were spinning, trying to find some way to turn the situation in their favor. They had to come up with a plan, something, anything that would allow them to reframe Diddy's confession as an act of courage, of redemption, rather than a confession of guilt. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battle for Diddy's future, and the stakes had never been higher. Outside of the courtroom, the world was waiting for a verdict. The news outlets were already running stories speculating on the impact of Diddy's admission. Some saw it as a moment of vulnerability, a sign of growth and introspection. Others, however, viewed it as the final nail in the coffin for his defense. The public opinion would no doubt be divided. But in that moment, in that courtroom, the only thing that mattered was the reaction of the jury. Diddy's words hadn't something they couldn't quite put their finger on. Had he just confessed to his guilt, or had he in fact done something much more powerful, something that could shift the entire course of the trial? The jury, who had been silent up until this point, exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully, others with furrowed brows. They had heard Diddy's confession. They had felt the weight of it, but now they had to decide what it meant. Did this change their perception of the case? Did it change how they would rule? Diddy sat back down, his shins resting on the table in front of him. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. His confession, his vulnerability, it was all out there now. The ball was in the jury's court. The trial had taken a sharp turn, and the only question that remained was whether this shocking admission would be the turning point Diddy needed or the fatal blow that ended everything he had worked so hard to build. The courtroom was still, but outside the world was watching. The courtroom remained in a state of quiet chaos after Diddy's confession. The magnitude of his words seemed to reverberate throughout the room, leaving everyone in a daze, trying to process what had just unfolded. The defense team was scrambling, trying to adjust their approach, and even the judge seemed momentarily lost in thought. But the real battle had just begun. Diddy had cracked open the door to his soul, exposing vulnerabilities. But now the real question was whether his raw honesty would be enough to sway the jury, or would it be seen as an admission of guilt too heavy to ignore. As Diddy sat back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him, his shoulders slumped slightly as though the of the moment had finally caught up with him. His eyes flickered to his legal team, who were still processing the enormity of what had just occurred. The quiet murmurs that followed his confession were not just from Courtroom, but from the world outside. News outlets were already buzzing with the unexpected turn of events. Diddy hadn't only admitted his mistakes, but he had essentially opened up his life to the public, leaving himself exposed in ways few, if any, public figures ever would. The defense team knew they had toked fast. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore. It was personal. Diddy had made it personal. His confession was an unfiltered look at the man behind the mogul, but now they had to turn that vulnerability into something the jury could relate to. The head lawyer stood up from his chair, adjusted his suit, and walked toward the bench with a quiet, measured confidence. He had a plan. He had to have one. If they were going to survive this, they needed to flip the narrative. They couldn't afford to let Diddy's confession be seen as a sign of guilt. They needed it to be seen as a moment of redemption. Meanwhile, the prosecution was ready to pounce. They had been waiting for this, anticipating some slip-up, some crack in Diddy's armor. Now that they had it, they had to act fast too. The confession had handed them exactly what they needed, a powerful piece of ammunition that could unravel the defense's carefully built case. Diddy had taken the power out of their hands for just a moment, but now they were going to take it back. His words had opened up a vulnerability in him that they could use against him. They couldn't let this opportunity slip by. They were going to hammer this home. And yet, for all their eagerness to capitalize on Diddy's moment of weakness, even the prosecution couldn't ignore the strange effect his words had on the courtroom. It was as if the entire room had held its breath, collectively processing what had been said. His words were powerful, but they were also human, raw, sincere, and brutally honest. His admission wasn't a simple confession of guilt, but a revelation about his character, his past, and the consequences of his actions. Was this the confession of a guilty man? Or was this the moment of redemption that he needed to save himself? The jury watched Diddy closely, their eyes darting back and forth as they tried to make sense of the gravity of what had been laid before them. They had come into this trial with one perspective, the allegations against Diddy, the accusations and the cold, hard evidence, but now they were witnessing a shift, a transformation. Diddy was no longer the untouchable mogul, the billionaire businessman with an empire. He was just a man facing the consequences of his actions, laying bare his flaws and mistakes for everyone to see. Could this honesty be enough to turn the tide in his favor? The judge, still composed, cleared his throat, bringing the room back to order, headed to the defense, then the prosecution, silently signaling that the trial needed to move forward. There was no time to waste. Diddy's words had broken the dam, but now it was up to both sides to figure out how they were going to move forward in the aftermath. The defense team took their cue and got to work. The head lawyer, standing confidently before the judge, began to address the court. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he started, his voice steady. "What Mr. Combs has just shared with you is not an admission of guilt. It is a man owning his past, acknowledging the mistakes he has made and striving to make amends. What you have witnessed today is a rare moment of vulnerability, and it is not to be mistaken for weakness. Mr. Combs has acknowledged his mistakes, but he has also shown his willingness to grow, to change, and to take responsibility for what has occurred." His words were carefully chosen, designed to frame Diddy's confession as an act of strength rather than a sign of guilt. But the defense team knew they couldn't rest on just those words. They had to show that Diddy was more than just a man who had made mistakes. They had to show that he was a man who had learned, grown, and was worthy of the jury's empathy. The prosecution, though, wasn't ready to back down. They had the upper hand now. The confession had given them exactly what they needed, a crack in the facade, a way to show the jury that Diddy was not the innocent mogul he claimed to be. The prosecutor stood up, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone firm. "What we have just witnessed is not a man facing the consequences of his actions. This is a man trying to manipulate your emotions, trying to make you feel sorry for him, to make you believe that because he is owning his mistakes, he deserves sympathy. But the truth is, Mr. Combs has spent years deceiving the public, hiding his true actions, and now he wants to use his confession as a shield. Do not let his words distract you from the evidence. The facts are clear. He is guilty of the charges against him." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The defense and prosecution were now locked in a battle of perception. Could Diddy's emotional honesty save him? Or would it be seen as a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his actions? The jury sat motionless, their faces unreadable. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The confession had broken the surface, but now they had to decide what lay beneath. The courtroom had become a battlefield of words, emotions, and consequences, and no one could predict which way it would tilt. As Diddy sat silently, his gaze fixed ahead, he understood the weight of what had just transpired. This was no longer just about the case. It was about who he was as a person, what he had become, and whether or not he could be redeemed. The battle for his future had entered a new phase, and the outcome was uncertain. The only thing that was clear was that Diddy's journey was far from over. The tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch. No one could have predicted that the trial of Diddy, a man who had spent years building an empire on the backs of his success and charisma, would evolve into such a personal, raw battle. His confession, his vulnerable admission of guilt, had torn down the walls he had so carefully constructed around his public image. Now, in the aftermath of his words, everything was in jeopardy. The prosecution had seized the advantage. While the defense was struggling to keep its grip on the narrative, but amid all the chaos, one thing became undeniably clear. Diddy had shifted the course of the trial, and the world was watching, waiting to see if his moment of honesty would be his salvation or his downfall. The defense team, still reeling from Diddy's unexpected confession, huddled together in a corner of the courtroom, furiously discussing their next move. Their strategy had always been clear: maintain control of the narrative. Paint Diddy as a misunderstood mogul who had made a few bad decisions but ultimately wasn't guilty of the charges. But now that narrative had been thrown into disarray. Diddy's confession had changed everything. There was no spinning it back to the way it was. They had to act fast, but more than that, they had to act smart. The head lawyer, who had been Diddy's trusted advisor for years, stood at the center of the group, his expression grim. He knew the stakes were higher than ever before. They weren't just fighting for Diddy's acquittal anymore. They were fighting for his future, for his reputation, and for his very freedom. Every decision they made from this point forward could either secure a chance for redemption or seal Diddy's fate forever. "We can't let this moment define him," the lawyer said, his voice low but urgent. "Yes, he's admitted to mistakes. Yes, he's been vulnerable. But we have to show the jury that he is not the man the prosecution is painting him to be. He is more than the mistakes he's made. We need to make them see the bigger picture." One of the junior attorneys nodded, still trying to process the weight of what had just transpired. "How do we even begin to recover from this? The confession has handed them everything they need. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." The lawyer took a deep breath. "No, we don't pretend it didn't happen, but we have to make the jury understand why Diddy did what he did. He wasn't just acting out of greed or malice. He was caught up in the system, the very system that he built. We have to make them see that if we focus on the man he is now, the person he's become in this moment of truth, maybe we can get through to them. We need them to see that he's more than just the mistakes of his past." The tension between the defense and prosecution was palpable. The courtroom felt like a battlefield. Outside the courtroom, the press was already buzzing with speculation, trying to determine what Diddy's confession would mean for his career, for his brand, and for the public. Would he be able to rise from this, or would this be the end of the road for one of the most iconic figures in the entertainment industry? Meanwhile, Diddy sat quietly at the defense table, his head down, his hands clasped in front of him. The weight of his own words was heavy, but there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he felt like he was being honest with himself, with everyone. He had spent his life hiding behind a wall of success, fame, and money, but today he had taken it all down. He wasn't just the man who built a billion-dollar empire. He was a man who had made mistakes, who had hurt people, and who was now paying the price. But it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future, and the jury, the judge, the world. They all had to decide if the man standing before them was worthy of a second chance. As the trial moved forward, the defense knew that they had one chance to make their case. They couldn't erase the confession, but they could frame it in a way that showed Diddy in a new light. The jury needed to see the full picture: the good, the bad, and the man who had come to terms with his past and was now ready to face the consequences. The prosecution, for all their confidence, couldn't ignore the shift that had taken place in the courtroom. Diddy had exposed a side of himself that no one had expected. His confession was not just a legal tactic. It was a human moment, a glimpse into the soul of a man who had been struggling with his own demons for years. But the prosecution was determined to use it against him. They couldn't afford to let the jury forget that behind the confession was a man who had still committed crimes. They had to keep pushing, keep reminding the jury of the severity of the charges, of the harm that Diddy's actions had caused. The prosecutor rose to speak again, his voice sharp as he addressed the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, what we've heard today is an emotional admission from the defendant. But let us not be swayed by his words alone. Yes, he has confessed to mistakes, but that does not absolve him of responsibility. His actions led to real harm, harm that cannot be undone by a simple apology. His empire built on the backs of those he exploited cannot be erased by a confession. We must look at the facts, we must look at the evidence, and we must hold him accountable for what he has done. Diddy's lawyer stood up, meeting the prosecutor's gaze. Your Honor, the prosecution wants to reduce this entire case to a few mistakes, but they missed the point. Mr. Combs has taken full responsibility for his actions. He is not denying what he did, but he is asking for a chance to move forward Toprov. That he can change, that is the essence of justice. He deserves the opportunity to make things right, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the world. The jury, silent throughout the back and forth, remained a mystery. What were they thinking? What were they feeling? Could they see past Diddy's past to the man who was standing before them now? Could they separate the mogul from the mistakes? The persona from the person? The clock was ticking and the fate of Diddy's life hung in abeyance. As the trial continued, it became clear that the battle was far from over. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. The courtroom was a reflection of the world outside, full of uncertainty, full of people trying to find truth in the midst of conflicting stories. But in that moment, as Diddy sat in silence, his confession was still reverberating through the room, through the minds of the jury and through the hearts of everyone who had been watching. Would it be enough to save him, or would it be the thing that doomed him once and for all? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom had taken on an almost suffocating stillness, the kind that you'll feel in your bones. The air felt heavy as Diddy sat there, his eyes locked straight ahead, his fingers tapping lightly against the table in a rhythm only he could feel. The weight of famement, the confession, the uncertainty of what was to come, it all seemed to converge in this one space. Outside the courthouse, reporters were speculating, trying to read between the lines of every movement, every shift in the courtroom. But inside, in that room, it was clear that things were no longer about what had been done. It was about what Diddy would do now. The prosecution had taken their shot, and now the defense was gearing up for their turn. There was a sense of urgency in the air, the clock ticking down. Every word, every gesture, every second counting toward the final decision. The defense team, still reeling from the initial shock of Diddy's confession, knew they had to do something drastic to shift the momentum. They had to humanize Diddy, not just as the powerful mogul the world knew, but as a man who was capable of redemption, someone who could rebuild his life and learn from his mistakes. The lead defense lawyer rose from his chair with a calm, deliberate grace, standing tall as he faced the judge Andrew. His eyes scanned the room, and for a moment it seemed as if he was weighing the gravity of what had just transpired. He began to speak, but his voice was not loud or frantic. There was a quiet intensity to it, a kind of weight that made everyone sit up and listen. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lawyer started, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable sincerity. What you've heard from Mr. Combs is not a defense. It is not an excuse. What you've heard today is the raw, unfiltered truth from a man who is ready to take responsibility for his actions, a man who is willing to face his demons. But we must also recognize that this moment, this confession, is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the first step toward accountability, not just for the mistakes of the past, but for the man he wants to become. The room held its breath as the lawyer's words sank in. Diddy's own legal team, sitting at their desks, exchanged looks of cautious optimism. This was the pitch they had been waiting for, the one that would reframe the narrative, one that would remind the jury that this wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about humanity. And in that moment, Diddy's humanity had been laid bare. "We can't ignore the damage done," the lawyer continued, his gaze never wavering from the jury. "But we also cannot allow ourselves to ignore the fact that people can change, that they can learn from their mistakes, and that they can grow. Mr. Combs is no different from any of us. He is a person who has made bad choices, but he is also a person who is capable of redemption. That is what this trial is about. It's not just about determining guilt. It's about what happens next. About whether we, as a society, allow someone who has made mistakes to have a second chance." The defense lawyer's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of what they represented. The courtroom had gone quiet again, the murmurs of the prosecution and the tension in Thiegelary fading into the background. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore, it was a moral one. The jury had been faced with the hard evidence, the accusations, the details that painted Diddy as a man who had crossed lines, who had hurt people, who had betrayed the very system that helped him build his empire. But now they were being asked to look beyond that, to see the man behind the accusations, to understand that the person who sat before them was more than his past actions. Diddy sat motionless as his lawyer spoke. His heart was racing, his mind spinning with the weight of everything he had confessato, everything he had admitted. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long time, he had allowed himself to truly be seen. Not as a celebrity or a mogul, but as a flawed man who had learned the hard way that success wasn't everything. He had built an empire, yes, but now he was faced with the task of rebuilding himself piece by piece. Starting here in this courtroom, the lawyer's words had given him hope. He wasn't just a defendant. He was a man who deserved a chance at redemption, a chance to prove that he could be better. But he knew that whether he would get that chance depended on the jury. Would they see him as a man who had made mistakes? Yes, Boutwell had learned and was ready to face the consequences. Or would they see him as just another celebrity who thought heckled by his way out of trouble, someone who couldn't be trusted? To change? As the defense lawyer wrapped up his argument, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, waiting for the moment when Diddy wouldn't again stand at the center of the room, facing the consequences of his actions. The prosecution would respond, of course they weren't finished yet. They had their own case to make, their own narrative to push. But for now, the spotlight was on Diddy, and in this moment, more than ever before, he felt the weight of his actions. The weight of the decisions he had made that had led him here. But he also felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of redemption. The judge looked toward the defense and then the prosecution. The court was moving toward its next phase, the final stretch off a trial that had captivated not just a courtroom but the world. Everyone had witnessed Diddy's confession, his moment of vulnerability. And now the decision was in the hands of 12 people. 12 people would determine if this confession was enough to transform a broken man into someone worthy of a second chance. The moments that followed felt like an eternity. The quiet, steady rhythm of the trial continued, but in Diddy's mind, everything had changed. The confession had been his turning point, but whether it would be the end of his journey or the beginning of a new chapter was still unknown. All he could do now was wait. Wait for the decision, wait for the consequences, and most importantly, wait to see if the man he was becoming could truly make amends for the man he had been. The courtroom was alive with a charged energy, almost suffocating in its intensity. The prosecution and defense had each presented their case, and now all eyes were on the jury. The moment of truth was approaching, and Diddy could feel the weight of it bearing down on him like a ton of bricks. His confession, his vulnerability, it was all out there now. He had laid bare his soul, admitted to the mistakes he had made, and now it was up to a dozen strangers to decide if that was enough to allow him a chance at redemption. Diddy sat quietly in his chair, his eyes fixed ahead, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. There were moments when he could almost hear the voices of his past, the ones telling him that he was untouchable, that he was invincible, but now those voices were gone. Now he was just a man who had made mistakes. Yes, but a man who had learned, or at least was trying to. The last few days had been an emotional roller coaster. Moments of hope, moments of doubt, and everything in between. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered now was what the jury would decide. As the jury deliberated, the courtroom was on edge, everyone anxiously awaiting the verdict. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Even the reporters who had been running live updates outside the courthouse seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the decision that would change everything. Diddy's entire future was in the hands of those 12 individuals. They were tasked not only with deciding his fate, but also with deciding whether he was a man who deserved a second chance or if the mistakes of his past were too great to overlook. Outside the courtroom, the public was already buzzing with speculation. Some believed that Diddy's confession had been a strategic move, an attempt to garner sympathy and sway the jury in his favor. Others saw it as armament of raw honesty, a man facing his demons and owning up to his past. The media had been split, and the pressure had been mounting on Diddy for weeks. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered now was how he was viewed in the eyes of the law. His public image, his reputation, those things were important, yes, but they were no longer his greatest concern. His greatest concern was the decision that was unfolding behind those closed doors. As the minutes ticked by, Diddy's thoughts kept returning to one central question. Could a man truly change? Could the man he was today be seen as Simeon worthy of redemption? Or would his past forever define him? He knew the gravity of his actions, knew the damage they had caused. He had built an empire on his charisma, his ambition, his ability to navigate a world that was often ruthless. But now, as he sat there, his future hanging in abeyance, he realized that all the wealth, all the fame, all the success in the world could not shield him from the consequences of his actions. What he had and could never be undone. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could still find a way to make things right. The courtroom door opened with a soft creak, and Diddy's heart skipped a beat. The jury had returned. The room fell silent once again, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The judge, with his calm and practiced demeanor, called the courtroom to order, and the foreperson of the jury stood up to deliver the verdict. Diddy's eyes were fixed on the jury, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The sweat on his palms had begun to beat up, and his heart pounded in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet he couldn't tear his gaze away from the foreperson who slowly made their way to the front of the room. As the foreperson handed the piece of paper to the judge, Diddy could feel the collective breath of the room being held. The judge took the paper, read it silently for a moment, then looked up at the courtroom with a serious expression. The jury has reached a verdict, the judge announced, his voice steady, but filled with a weight that made everyone sit a little straighter. Will the defendant please rise? Diddy stood, his legs feeling like they might give way beneath him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as he slowly rose to his feet, his hands now slightly shaking, clenched into fists at his sides. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. No matter what happened, he knew that the world would be watching him his life, as he knew it would never be the same again. The judge cleared his throat and looked over at the foreperson. Has the jury reached a unanimous decision? The judge asked. The foreperson nodded, their face unreadable. We have your honor. The judge nodded and turned to face Diddy. Mr. Combs? The judge said, his voice heavy. The jury has found you guilty of the charges against you. Diddy's heart sank. The room around him seemed to blur, and for a split second he wondered if he had heard the words correctly. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, fear, and regret. How could this be? Had he really come this far only to have it all come crashing down in an instant? But then the judge spoke again, and his words were different this time. However, the judge continued, his tone shifting. Fedri has also found that the defendant has shown genuine remorse for his actions, and they have recommended a sentence that takes into account his willingness to confront his past and seek redemption.